So, hello everybody, welcome to our Central, the podcast of Orbify, where we invite sustainability experts to discuss about sustainability matters. Today we have with us Selina from LRQA, and we're very glad to have you here. I'm very excited to have you here, and I'm very excited to get to know about more you, and also I'm very excited to get about what you do there, about your insights, about sustainability matters, and in general about your background. So, could you please tell us a bit more about yourself?
Perfect. Thank you, Konstantinos. And it's a pleasure really to be here on that podcast today. So I'm Selina. I'm senior consultant with a focus on sustainable supply chains. I'm personally based in Germany, Frankfurt. And maybe before, I just say a bit tell you a bit about LRQA and what we do there, and maybe a few comments on my career background so far. So I guess what always interested me in kind of like what I wanted to do was something about doing the right thing, or at least helping to do the right thing. Meaning, I wanted to understand, okay, why are there still so major deficits in the area of sustainability? Looking at, for example, social inequalities, discrimination, but not only at home, so to say, in Germany, but also, of course, the globe. I guess 2013, the Rana Plaza collapse was one of the key events, I guess, for many people in the sustainability area. That was, really striking for me as well. And even now, I mean, companies being involved in allegations across the globe relating to human rights violations, etc. So I really wanted to understand why that is still happening and what can we do to kind of like try at least to end that. So I decided to learn more about it from the kind of like political side of it. So thinking about, okay, what do the governments do? How can politics influence this? So I joined an interdisciplinary study program focusing on especially EU politics. And I guess I quite quickly also learned the benefits, but also challenges of different kind of governing approaches, hard law, soft law approaches, etc. And while that all was interesting in theory, I then also wanted to understand, okay, but how then is it in practice? Like, what do companies do with it? Like, what do they do to implement regulations? Where do they have the challenges? What do they also do voluntarily, etc.? So after doing the bachelor's, I then started the career in sustainability consulting at a consultancy in Hamburg that was very much already focused on human rights in the supply chain. And then, worked there for quite a time, realized, okay, I also want to do or learn more about the environmental perspective of things, so not just human rights, but also environmental, and I guess it's closely related anyways. So I did my master's in London, got a bit involved into the investor and financial side of things there as well. I guess a bit obvious for London as well. And I guess investors also play a big role, especially in sustainability. And then I ended up in Brussels for some time working as a policy advisor for the European Sustainable Investment Forum. And there I really had the chance to kind of see the practice of this law and the regulations being done. So I was working on the different Green Deal legislations, CSRD, CSDDD. I'm sure we're going to touch upon that later on maybe a bit as well. And it was super interesting to see how the laws are actually being made and where also the differences exist between what I learned in theory and then, actually being in Brussels and seeing that. So great time, learned a lot, but also realized, okay, I want to be closer again to the actual companies and helping them deal with those sometimes theoretic, sometimes very bureaucratic legislative requirements. And now I'm very happy to be doing that, being able to do that at LRQA. So I joined 2.5 years ago when it was still formerly Elevate, so one of the big social and environmental compliance assessment bodies. And now we're part of LRQA, so part of a leading global assurance provider that really much offers services for different clients from different industries. And our services are very much centered exactly around those core global emerging trends and also challenges that we see emerging. So everything around ESG considerations, like the increased requirements that we see are being put on companies, challenges around supply chain complexity, but then also risks related to cyber security threats. So that's what we do at LRQA. We have different kind of departments or divisions. So we have expertise in assessment, so again, social and environmental compliance audits, for example, but also product quality assessments. We do inspections, we offer services in cybersecurity, and I personally am part of the advisory team, where we then leverage all the different data and insights that we get also from the other services we offer to really support clients from across industries in setting up responsible sourcing programs, managing the risks adequately and effectively, and helping them to minimize any negative impacts that there may be. So, very happy to looking back at always wanting to try at least to help to do the right things, that I'm now somewhat able to do that. Yeah. And that was a very long introduction.
Very impressive, actually, how your whole career from the start to now has always been around sustainability and actually going deeper inside it and actually having practical and theoretical knowledge that gives a very nice 360 overview about sustainability impact and how that works. But I noticed on your LinkedIn that sometimes you talked about EUDR, and I'm very curious to know, how do you work with the EUDR? Is it something on your responsibilities? Is something that you advise people on? What is you and EUDR? What's the connection?
Exactly. So EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation, is, a major piece that has entered into force, that will start to apply in 1 year, very likely. And it's a core supply chain regulation, right? So it requires companies to assess, especially deforestation risks, but also human rights risks in their supply chain. And through that, it's yet again, in that sense, another sort of set of requirements that applies to companies, and deforestation being also a major supply chain risks that companies have to tackle. So, of course, that's also something we support companies with at LRQA. So it's part of our supply chain, sustainable supply chain service offering. And at LRQA, I'm the subject matter expert for that specific topic. So really focusing or bringing together this environmental perspective into the supply chain topics that we have. That's how we support companies there, very much providing advisory service in terms of understanding what needs to be done, how can I do it, how can I leverage synergies with other processes I already have in place, with also other requirements that they may want to meet. That's also core part of our work at LRQA.
And before you said that one of the reasons why you started working in sustainability was the impact, that you were thinking, what is the impact here? How can I make an impact? And I'm very curious to know, what do you think about the UDR and the impact on sustainability? How do you think this is going to affect us, Europe, outside of Europe, the importers and exporters? What are the significant benefits of UDR?
It's a good question. I guess it can be answered from a range of different perspectives.
Right.
So I think generally the EUDR is definitely a strong step towards the right goal, and the impact being reducing and ending deforestation, and with that also minimizing the EU's environmental footprint. So I think the general aim and idea of the EUDR is great, and it can definitely have an impact if implemented right. I think what also is a big impact of the EUDR, irrespective yet of how exactly it will be implemented, that it has managed to put attention on the topic, not only of deforestation, but also on supply chain management more broadly, with a very much new drive, right? So companies are now actually worrying about not being able to place their products on the EU market anymore because they don't, if they don't sufficiently meet the requirements. Plus, they are facing supply chain disruptions if their suppliers do not manage to comply with the EUDR. So it's having this trickling down effect where we see companies ever more looking at, okay, I need to find a way to manage my supply chain. I need to get transparency into my supply chain. I need to engage with my suppliers. And I think that's already quite a nice impact we see, is that the topic of managing supply chains is not going away or not being less important, but rather reinforcing this need. Yeah.
And one of the backgrounds that you have is also about the more broader sustainability, ESGs, social justice, as you said before, human rights. How EUDR can actually be combined with these matters? How do you think EUDR is going to impact these matters also?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, possible different ways of answering that. I think from a topic perspective, the link between deforestation, but then also human rights and more social compliance-related topics is definitely there as well. I mean, even within the EUDR itself, deforestation is kind of like the key word that is within that regulation. But if you look into more detail, you'll see, okay, there are also aspects in terms of ensuring that local laws are being complied with that can then relate to also human rights, to social rights, labor laws, governance-related aspects, etc. So it's not only about making sure there is no deforestation occurring, it's also about making sure the production of that certain product or commodity applies with local laws, and it's also in compliance with international human rights. So we have already within the piece of legislation that direct connection, and it should always be, considered together with the topic of deforestation. Because also in practice, when deforestation occurs, that more often than not also goes directly together with violations of human rights, right? So if deforestation occurs, it may displace communities, and it is often linked to land grabbing. So that again turns to violations of indigenous people's rights, for example, or it can lead to violations of indigenous people's rights. It can comprise labor rights, and also it's closely linked to governance risks. So if we see in a country that there are weak law enforcement mechanisms or just generally a weak governance, the risk of deforestation occurring from the start is also much bigger, and the risk of local conflicts occurring because local protection is not really enforced as strongly. It can occur. So the link to, or put it this way, deforestation as such shouldn't be considered as an isolated environmental topic. It's very much closely related to human rights and also governance-related aspects. So that from a topic side. Plus, from a processual perspective, the linkage is quite obviously there as well, right? As I mentioned earlier, as I see it, the EUDR is very much a supply chain management and product management regulation in the end, because you need to ensure your product is compliant, you need to ensure you get the information and transparency onto your supply chain. And you need to have a management system in place that allows you to identify risks within the supply chain and then act upon them. Have preventive measures in place, prioritize your action, etc. And once you have that general process in place, it will help you to not only identify deforestation risks, but also identify human rights risks, labor rights risks. So it's, I think, from the process-wise perspective, something that can definitely also be leveraged for managing social justice and human rights concerns in a
This is
broader
a great
perspective.
point because I feel like we're so much focused on deforestation right now that we ignore the rest of the part of this regulation. And everybody talks about, traceability, deforestation, degradation, but nobody talks about the human rights and local laws that are actually inside the regulations, as you said, and how this is like a more general regulation that it should be seen as such. And I have one question because this is the elephant in the room for every topic when you discuss about the UDR. The proposed, postponation, I will call it that way, of the transition period. And we've seen it, we're waiting, I think it's going to be voted next week, if I remember correctly. And how do you feel this is going to affect companies that are already compliant, or how it's going to affect companies that are not compliant? I mean, of course, it's going to give them a nice time to be compliant. But in general, having such an important regulation that's getting delayed, how do you think this is perceived?
Well, short answer, I guess, would be it's not, in my opinion, not perceived that well. But of course, as you mentioned, it also brings some benefits to some companies.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess again, it depends on who you look at as the stakeholder that could be impacted or is impacted by that delay. So maybe just for a brief context, again, as you mentioned, this proposal was made by the Commission to delay the start of the application by 1 year to December 2025. The Council, so the EU member states, have already approved that delay, so they agree to having such a delay. And now we're just waiting for the Parliament to also approve that delay. And as you said, I think it's in the plenary vote in Brussels on 13th or 14th November that they want to vote on that specific delay. And just a side note, I guess I find it super striking that, and I guess it can only happen in the EU, that they are actually fast tracking a delay procedure. Because in the beginning, when the Commission put out that proposal, I was like, let's see how quickly they will actually manage to implement such a delay. And then Council was super quick to say, yes, we're approving. And even the Parliament was like, yeah, we're doing this fast track procedure now. So I feel like that's already telling in itself that the EU
Yeah, exactly.
can really make that happen all of a sudden. But that just as a side note. And we also see, or what I just saw as well, is that the like one party in the parliament, so the EPP, they are tabling amendments as well to the EUDR. So that has been put forward, will also be voted on in that session, likely, or at least we're expecting that. And that is a bit, that would have an even bigger impact, in my opinion, because Commission has proposed to just delay it by 1 year. The amendments tabled by the EPP suggest to delay the whole thing by 2 years. Plus, they want to exempt traders from the requirements of the EUDR. They're suggesting to add a new country risk classification. So they're starting to go into the kind of like substance of the EUDR now and trying to like changes, and that I think could have a potential impact if it goes through, because then we're opening the whole legislative procedure again. We're looking at trilogue negotiations again, and that's going to massively further delay the whole negotiations, in my opinion. That said, coming back to your question, looking at those companies that already started to get ahead of the EUDR, started to implement the processes, get all the data they need, run the risk assessment, etc. I think for them the delay is probably somewhat frustrating, and I mean we have seen also the public statements, right, of the quite advanced companies that are saying, look, it's not good to delay now. Also looking, of course, at the environment and the forest as such, like they, I guess, don't like that delay. They can't, like, we can't really afford to just wait another year to like try to stop deforestation, right? So I guess that in that sense, it's very much frustrating to have that delay. On the other hand, based on my experience and what I see, most companies are not, like, if the application, like if the EUDR would start applying as of end of December this year, most companies wouldn't be compliant by that time, because those companies that haven't really started yet, there's no way they can make it within the next 2 months. Like it's just too much work, too many details. Yeah, it's impossible. So I guess for them, it's really much a gift, and it's really like a big benefit to have now 1 additional year to get prepared, get everything in place. And that's what I'm stressing as well, always in the discussion with clients, to not relax now and be like, oh, nice, so we'll have another 12 months, but rather be like, okay, we have to get it done now, and we have to try to set everything up. Even if it's just, in that sense, a best effort approach. Like I think, you shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good, in that sense that you you should accept that you won't have that one perfect solution right away, but work on it, use the additional month of time. I think that's
like, I really think that this is a gift, a commercial gift also. I mean, talking from the marketing perspective, that my role allows me to do so. I really believe that it's a commercial gift also for companies that are already compliant, even though they're gonna be frustrated. It's gonna take them 1 more year for the regulation. However, I'm sorry, let me close my emails because it's annoying. So it's definitely a gift for companies that are already compliant, because they can actually say to everyone, look, we're sustainable enough, we already proceeded, we already have like regulations ready, so you can trust us about our beliefs. And for the companies who are not, they really have to actually move forward and be as much fast as they can in order to catch up with the regulation. But my question is, because you have like clients and you talk with clients, why these people were not on time during this deadline? Like why it took them so long?
Yeah, it's a good and tough question. Maybe just briefly to add to your previous question in terms of the commercial implications. I think it's also in that sense somewhat, like, I mean, it's definitely a benefit for those companies that are already ahead of things, and also for the suppliers mainly. Being ahead of things means securing access to the EU market, right? Securing the business relationships with EU customers. So that definitely is a benefit. At the same time, I guess I'm also seeing the potential risk of having companies that are different stages, asking for different things from suppliers. Like, it's just creating a bit more chaos, right? In terms of, okay, some companies may already be very pushy and say, okay, you have to implement this and that. Others don't really care yet, that you can continue the business relationship. So I guess it's potentially also creating even more confusion on, especially at the supplier side, in terms of, okay, what do we need to deliver now, by when, how exactly shall it look like, etc. So just as a comment. And then, for that question on why did it take the company so long? I mean, I wish I knew. Because it's not like the EUDR just came out of nowhere, right? It has been in force for quite a while. The negotiations up to the entry into force were there as well. So it's not like it's just completely out of nowhere. So I guess those companies that are, paying attention to those regulatory developments should have known earlier, and already get started at that. But then at the same time, I can also totally understand why they were were a bit hesitant, maybe because even though the EUDR has entered into force, there's still a lot of uncertainty and unclarity, right, and how exactly to implement those requirements. The general idea is clear, the general approach is clear. However, then in the details, how exactly do I collect the information? Where do I need to store it? In what format? Like the whole discussion around the information system and like how to register and how to get the access to due diligence statements, etc. Still a lot of unclarity. I mean, now, beginning of October, we got the updated guide, or we got the guidance and the updated FAQ, so that's already helpful. But I think the core question is always, what do I need to do? Like, what is sufficient in the end? And that's something, I guess, even now we can't really tell 100% because it's going to depend much on how strictly will the national competent authorities enforce the whole thing. Like, how much evidence do you need to provide on top of your regular due diligence system or statement? So I think that's, all of those are reasons for companies maybe to be a bit more hesitant. Plus now, even with the delay, I guess companies can say, like, good that we haven't put too much investment yet into it because now we still have some additional time. So I think that these are all factors that explain why companies may be hesitant. And I guess also the general mood or kind of political developments are maybe at the moment not that encouraging for any kind of like ESG and sustainability efforts, right? I think that's also a factor to keep in mind, that just the general,
You said it in a very, very politically correct way. That was very interesting. You're very right. I'm not very happy that you're right on this last part, but I think that we see that a lot. But I also agree with you that I see a lot of companies, especially working with some EUDR companies, that they were not ready also because they were not trusting EU, in a sense that Traces was not ready, the information was not ready, the FAQ was not ready. So people were saying, okay, if we don't have all this information, why we should be ready also? And they were expecting this delay to happen just because of the lack of information that the EU was providing to them. So I kind of see, the pattern from both ways, how everybody was like kind of delaying everything in general. So, and what about like the other thing that I noticed through Orbify is that a lot of big companies are actually regulated already, they're compliant with UDR, but at the same time, small stakeholders and small companies have like major issues. And can you tell me what challenges you think like more small stakeholders are facing in regards to
Yes.
UDR compliance?
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether it really in the end is then a question of size in the end, because we also see big companies, of course, still challenging, like especially companies that are not even, or let's put it this way, I guess there are some companies that are naturally more linked to deforestation and have naturally managed the topic more in the past, like especially, I don't know, companies in the food sector looking at cocoa beans, etc. And then, of course, also other companies in the timber and furniture industries where we have the EU timber regulation that already applies, etc. So I think depending on where you sit, you may be a big company in a sector that never really thought about deforestation before, like looking at, for example, the automotive industry with rubber and rubber tires all of a sudden, consumer care products, etc. So I think, just to make that point, also big companies may not be quite readily prepared for the EUDR. But of course, also smaller companies are struggling. And I think there are different factors that are posing this challenge. One being sometimes just really understanding what do I need to do and how can I best do it. So kind of like balancing the quite comprehensive requirements together with making sure it's somehow operationalized, like put into practice, can be operationalized in a practical way. Because I guess there is some range of having super advanced, very complex kind of setup of systems, trying to really in the detail get everything in place versus trying to be very pragmatic, basing on what you already have, just getting this understanding, okay, where can we leverage what the processes we already have in place. So I think that understanding or that handling of being overwhelmed in terms of, there's so much new coming up, how do I practically implement that is one of the biggest or one of the big challenges that we see. Plus, I guess other challenge, especially for smaller companies, is getting the capacities on board, right? We are talking to companies with teams or sustainability teams that can be quite small, right? And maybe just one person or maybe two. and even if it's a bigger team, they have quite a lot of work to do. So who's managing the EU Deforestation Regulation? That alone requires quite a lot of manpower to implement that and to set up the necessary systems. So we were hearing from some companies that are, I guess, also rather large, but that they're planning to at least hire 3 new people to take care of the implementation.
Wow.
And the smaller companies may not be able to just do that, right? Just for one piece of legislation. So I think that's a big challenge that we see there as well, that is hindering, getting started. Plus, getting the buy-in from management, I think, is very crucial here as well, to really make sure you, as a maybe a sustainability expert, have that kind of backup from management to invest the resources and to maybe hire someone or get external support, etc. That can sometimes be challenging, though I think the EUDR gives quite a good example of how it directly impacts your business if you don't manage it well. So I think there it makes it at least a bit easier to make that point towards management. And then,
Sorry, go
sorry.
on. No, go
I
on.
think, another then big challenge is, of course, dealing with the data or getting the data in face of or in light of not having access to the data. So what we see is that most companies know their tier 1 suppliers, and that's great already. But then going further and understanding, okay, where do my first tier suppliers get the product or commodity from? Where do they, like their suppliers, get it from? Like what is kind of like the first element in the value chain that we're looking at can be super challenging. And especially here, finding this pragmatic way of, okay, how do I prioritize now my efforts? Like where do I start searching in that sense? I think is still a challenge for most companies. Yeah.
Like what you say actually brings to my mind 2 questions that are completely different. So I'm thinking which one to address first, because both are very interesting, and I would like to know your opinion from both. Okay, I'm gonna go with the first one, because we said about companies actually trying to be compliant and following some systems and actually hiring more people. How do you see companies actually trying to build a UDR compliance thing that actually can be helpful for future or present other regulations? For example, I know there are some regulations in Germany that they can be kind of not similar, but like kind of similar to UDR or other due diligence, regulations in general. And I'm trying to think what would you advise to companies to do in order to build a more sustainable system to touch base in different regulations at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point, and that's exactly what we're always trying to kind of like talk with companies about, because setting up a due diligence system for EUDR is great, but if you already know, you also have to comply with the CSDDD, for example, the Corporate
Right.
Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, then why not think about that from the very beginning rather than having kind of like individual approaches for each individual legislation? So I think, very, very relevant question, very, very relevant topic to give some thought on. I guess there's no one solution and one answer to say, okay, that's the best way to do it. I guess first step that we would always advise companies to do, and that we of course also support with, is to really understand the scope of requirements that you want to cover. So what do you want your due diligence system in the end to cater to? Is it EUDR for certain products? Is it CSDDD more widely? Do you also have to comply with the CSRD, for example, so in terms of reporting on your due diligence system? Like, what is it that you want to achieve? Plus, also, what is your own kind of like ambition level? Like, do you want to seek full compliance? I mean, if you're a EU-based company, then likely you have to be compliant at some point. But we're also speaking to companies outside of the EU that may not have to, from a legal standpoint, be totally compliant, but they know they will get those requests from EU-based companies, and they want to stay ahead. So kind of like the ambition level of, okay, where do you want to go? What is your kind of aim or level that you're aiming at? So kind of be clear, okay, what do we need to, what's the benchmark? Where do we want to get? And then really much try to see, okay, what is already there that you can leverage to build up your due diligence system. And how I see, especially kind of like the interrelation between EUDR and CSDDD, is that the CSDDD gives you kind of like this horizontal perspective to it, right? Like you have to have a system to be able to assess across your entire value chain. So not only upstream, not only raw material level, but really entire value chain, be able to identify, at least at a general level, what are the potential adverse impacts that we see occurring, not only in relation to deforestation or environment, but also in relation, or especially in relation to human rights. So that's kind of like the first layer to say, okay, I'm mapping, or first of all, I have to understand my entire value chain. And what do I mean when I say entire value chain? It doesn't mean you have to list all individual supplies, like up to 5,000, 10,000 supplies. That's not the point of it. It's rather understanding what are my operations, like what are my activities, what I do at my own sites, what do my first tier suppliers do, what do their suppliers do, tier 2, tier 3, etc. What is happening downstream, so what kind of transportation, distribution, warehouses, services do we leverage, and looking at all these kind of different activities, where do we see the risk of human rights violations, environmental violations being most likely, and then potentially also most severe. That's kind of like the first exercise. And then I guess you would add this more vertical perspective of the EUDR, because okay, for that certain product that we're sourcing, we also have an increased deforestation risk, and we need to kind of like anyway go down to the raw material level because of the EUDR. So kind of trying to find a pragmatic way of conceptualizing this kind of setup. What do I do first general screening, then going into detail for certain areas, maybe due to the EUDR, maybe because you see an increased risk on a certain activity area under the CSDDD. So I think that first kind of mapping exercise is really, really helpful. And then, I guess it goes into the detail of where do you as a company stand? Like, what do you already do? Do you already collect information from your suppliers through, for example, SAQs, so self-assessment questionnaires? Do you ask already for some sort of certifications? Understanding what does that information give you? Like, does it help you understand the level of deforestation risk? Does it help you understand the level of risk in terms of managing human rights and ensuring that human rights are respected? Like, understanding, okay, what do I already have? Because I feel like mostly, or more often than not, companies have already quite a lot of data and information out there. It's just about structuring it and bringing it all together and integrating it into this wider due diligence and risk management approach.
That's very interesting, actually, and thank you for the steps. Like I think that's gonna be so important for the audience actually to get to know that in that sense. Like, it was very nice with the way you described it. I would like to know, what do you think about third party kind of validation of different companies in terms of EUDR, for example, PEFC, or like also Orbify that provides you special data, or other companies that provide data for suppliers. How do you think that could be helpful for the small or bigger stakeholders? Do you think that is needed, or what EU provides is more than enough to actually do the job?
So yes, I think the role of audit schemes, third-party verifications of raw materials and also specific processes or at supplier level is definitely very, very important, right? It's also a core requirement under the EUDR to have that information you gather somehow verified. So it definitely is a major element, very critical. And then I guess it's about choosing, okay, which kind of assessment do I run, and what does it cover? Like, does it, for example, only verify, okay, for that certain plot of land based on satellite images, for example, as you do we see a risk of deforestation occurring, yes or no? Or does the certification or verification also allow you to then check on the ground, do we see any risk of human rights violations occurring, or any labor rights that are being potentially violated? So I think that's important as a company to think about, okay, what can different certifications or verification schemes deliver, and how does it help me then kind of like understand the level of risk and mitigate also the level of risk. Plus, what we also see that some companies tend to say, okay, well, I have all my materials FSC certified, for example, or be it any other certification scheme. Is that sufficient for complying with the EUDR? And I guess my answer would always be, it doesn't exempt you from any obligations under the EUDR. Like, it's not the green line that you may want to, that you hope for. However, it will definitely help you, right, to get certain information to better assess the level of risk. But nevertheless, you have to have your own kind of like due diligence system in place and have that especially documented. I think that's another key point, to really make sure, if you're a company, document whatever you have in place and whatever you are already doing, even if it's not perfect yet, even if you say, okay, I have to kind of cut off, like, we don't get all the information, or we have to deal just with what we have. document all of that to be able to say, okay, that's what we're doing at the moment, and we're trying our best to come to a conclusion that that helps under the EUDR.
And now I'm gonna go back to the question I wanted to ask before that I was like having the dilemma between which to choose. Because the UDR also, as you said, is changing the market because we're gonna see a lot of change in the market of who is gonna importing, exporting, who is gonna be the main suppliers, how all this is gonna go. Can you tell me some examples how you see the market changing, developing because of UDR compliance and based on the needs of the companies in order to be UDR compliant?
So, sorry, I have to double check. So, in terms of how the landscape is,
It's changing.
sorry,
Yeah,
just
how
generally.
the market is developing, changing, and how you see EUDR is actually affecting the market.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. So yeah, I think in general, I mean, we see a lot of movement in the markets, right? And in the wider ESG landscape, we have the EUDR legislation that comes with its own product-related requirements. We have the CSDDD. So there is still a lot of regulation that is already out there and will start to apply, especially in the European Union market. So I think this trend to really be aware of your supply chain risks and to prevent any sort of supply chain disruptions is definitely a key theme that we now see emerging within the markets. I mean, what we also see, especially with the EUDR, the impacts on the markets in terms of potential cost increases, right? At least that's being discussed in terms of if, just the prices for the raw materials will potentially increase if you don't, or if you have to add all those kind of like requirements and put them on the burden of the suppliers. So I think those are kind of like market effects that are being discussed. Whether they will in the end really materialize, I guess, also somewhat still needs to be seen. But I think a core focus should then, especially looking at that aspect of putting all the requirements of the suppliers, should be to really engage with the suppliers. So I think that's also another thing that we see, or at least hope to see more, is really this engagement with the suppliers, consulting stakeholders, those that are actually affected by the requirements, that have to deliver the information to you, even if they're not themselves based in the EU. Engage with them, train them, so also provide some sort of capacity building measures or support. Maybe provide some financial incentives as well to kind of like move to more sustainable agricultural practices, and leverage also kind of the industry and multi-stakeholder forums that are out there to exert some sort of influence, because I guess that's another challenge, right? That companies that are based in the EU or whatever may not have the full kind of like leverage, the full power of influence to say, okay, you as a supplier need to do it this and that way. It's rather if they all come together and they support that, provide that support, understand what are the challenges of the supplier, and then they can, I guess that's important to then move forward and make sure you get the information you need and allow the supplier also to continue to have market access and not be disproportionately negatively affected by the whole requirements.
Yeah, because like we hear a lot of small suppliers actually being very afraid about that because they don't know how they're gonna continue in the market. Like we had some conversation with some suppliers from different locations in the world, and they were actually thinking how they're gonna continue importing inside the EU and if it's actually is worth it financially for them to do so. And that's very 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 interesting, especially in case of coffee or cacao that we see a lot of like very small suppliers having issues to do so. And I'm very curious to see how this is gonna be solved because hopefully it's gonna be solved. And I would like to know
Yeah,
because before
and maybe,
yeah.
sorry, just maybe on that note, because I also saw that I haven't read it in detail yet, but the Commission also just recently, I think a few days ago, published this communication on the strategic framework for international cooperation engagement, right? Where I guess that targets exactly those topics as well, because they're planning to, or they're kind of like specifying the kind of outreach and dialogue formats that they want to implement or are already implementing initiatives to kind of get people together to engage in dialogue with the different countries, and especially, I guess, those where most of the suppliers sit for certain commodities. So I think I'm just saying that's something I think, or where I hope to see more activity, more engagement happening, and I think that's also something the EU has on its radar, of course, as well,
Yeah, I
to
think that's very
manage that
important.
adequately. Yeah.
And I also see local governments actually taking a role in there. Like I see local governments investing a lot of money for small suppliers to be compliant because they know that a huge part of this of their local community, local finance actually comes from EU market. So I hope these two roles, like EU plus local governments, can actually help the suppliers to move forward. And yeah, let's fingers crossed for that because it's a great market for all of us. And before you kind of like touch based on the next steps of EUDR regulation, and you kind of like said what you expect, but I would like to know a bit in detail, more in detail than before. What do you see the next steps in EUDR implementation? In
Yes.
case, of course, there is, the delay.
Yeah. I guess, that will be crucial now, right? So what I'm expecting to see is there
Yeah.
will be the delay. I think that is almost like very certain now that this will come through. So there will be the delay by 1 year. Um, Again, I'm seeing the potential risk that amendments are, or that the amendments that have been tabled by the EPP in the European Parliament get approved, or at least they get a majority for those to be rediscussed. And then I see the risk of the whole thing being renegotiated, or in terms, at least in terms of, okay, can we lessen the bureaucratic stress on companies? Where can we kind of like water down requirements? I feel like that there is a potential risk that that will still happen. Fingers crossed it won't.
Yeah.
But that's at least something I could potentially see. Plus, I guess also, even if no amendments are being tabled, or if they don't go through, the Commission has planned in those kind of like review cycles, right, where they kind of see, okay, do we need to include additional commodities, for example, in the scope of the
Exactly.
EUDR? So that's something I could imagine happening for maize, for example, as another core commodity. So I think in the substance, like the original intention and objective of the EUDR, that will stay. Like I don't see any much change in that sense of like you have to address that topic somehow, you have to manage it. Again, see the risk of it potentially being further watered down or at least changed to make it more pragmatic to companies. Um, and then I just hope it's not, lowering the overall ambition of the whole set.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Hopefully, this is not gonna change. I hope it's not gonna change the regulation. Maybe the deadline. Okay, I get it, but I hope it's
yeah,
not gonna change the overall regulation. And I have
yeah.
one more question, like two more questions before we go. The first one is, how would you advise companies to stay ahead of all these regulations? They're every time changing. Even me, I don't know you, I'm like working in this
Mm-hmm.
market, but every day I'm like, okay, another regulation popped up, another change popped up. It's so hard to actually follow up. And I'm thinking, what about companies? How would you advise a company to be ahead of the time?
Yeah, I mean it's a I think challenging task in any case, but I think I mean just from a very practical side, I feel like there are quite a lot of like information forums out there, like I don't know, LinkedIn posts popping up, etc. So if you're trying to kind of like regularly check in there and see what are the latest discussions, what do we see emerging, what are the topics being discussed, like those kind of tools can help, right? Like looking at independent news outlets that can like try to summarize the overall negotiation or debates on in the area of sustainability, because that's some element of it. But then the other one, I guess, is just making sure you have kind of like a sound basis. And I think
Yeah.
having set up this due diligence system is one of those things, because that is kind of like a core element, and I think it won't go away. That you as a company have to have a system in place that allows you to screen your suppliers, not maybe until the very raw material for all of them, but at least for your first year suppliers, where relevant also indirect suppliers, have a system in place to screen that, have a system in place to be informed about any adverse impacts. So there are risk platforms out there, right? I mean, at LRQA, we have our own platform EIQ where we exactly do that. Like we can screen for country at a country level for certain human rights, environmental governance related risks at a product level. And that allows you to already see, okay, where are potential risks coming up? What are the trends? Like, how do we see those risk topics emerging? And having a view on that and regularly updating those risk assessment, I think, is something you should, as a company that wants to be prepared and stay ahead of the curve, have in any case. Plus, having those measures and regularly reviewing whether they're really effective to prevent any potential adverse impacts, right? And those measures be very basic in terms of just having a supplier code of conduct that you get a clear acknowledgement of from your suppliers, or get even a contractor assurance on. it may be a bit more advanced, where you say, okay, we're actually engaging with the suppliers, we're offering capacity building measures, we offer trainings, be it remote, on-site. It may be that you do certain assessments for certain groups of suppliers. So this kind of like, in a sense, basic approach towards due diligence, identify, prevent, mitigate, remediate where necessary, is something that won't go away, and that every company, in the sense, should have an approach from, to then be able to cater to all different potentially upcoming regulations. Plus, just to make that note for CSRD, for example, because that is, I guess, a reporting regulation, so not necessarily due diligence, but really much reporting. But even there, if you have a due diligence system in place, it will help you fulfill the CSRD requirement as well, because they're also looking at the impacts that you as a company have on the environment, on the society, plus then, of course, also risks and opportunities, etc. But yeah, I think that, I guess, would be one thing to make sure to have in place.
That's so insightful. Like, I think everybody should take notes after this podcast from the things you said. It's super insightful. And I have one last question that's more like a tradition we do in this podcast. It's kind of out of the subject of sustainability, but it's more personal to you. Every guest, actually, in the last part of the podcast, say something kind of inspirational, something motivational that moves themselves, and they want to share with the audience. It may be a quote, it may be also something about sustainability. If that something inspires you, it can be a way that you live your life. It can be something that gets you out of the bed every day. And it's also your safe space in the way that if you ever want to hear that back from your side, you can actually hear this podcast and remind yourself what you said. So you can take a moment if you want to think about it, and you can share it with your audience any inspiration that you want to.
It's a tough one, I think, because there's so many things that keep myself at least motivated and that inspire me every day. But I think, yeah, I don't know if that's a super motivational quote, but I think realizing that even every little step, or a step that you think may be little in relation to all the different requirements that are out there, all the different things you could potentially do, is already the right thing to do and is already helpful. So don't, I guess, be afraid of thinking, oh, it's not sufficient yet. Just go ahead, try, and yeah, really, really also realizing that there may not be the perfect solution that covers everything you need in one go, but rather trying out, accepting that there are errors, accepting that you need to adjust later on. I think that's very important to keep in mind, and also stay motivated, and not be frustrated by all the things that could potentially go wrong, or where you see challenges, where you don't get the data, etc. Really just accept it's step by step. We need to be flexible in that sense.
That's very
Yeah,
nice.
and maybe that's one of
And before we conclude, I would like to know if you want to share some information about yourself, about how people can find you, maybe your personal LinkedIn or your company profile or something, an event you're going to attend that you may be open to meeting people. If you'd like to know, if you'd like to share with the audience.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, easily reachable via LinkedIn. I guess that's the most direct link to Selina Rathke at LinkedIn. And then also, of course, via the company at LRQA, we're always happy to receive emails or hear from you. We're also hosting a webinar on the CSDDD very shortly. So yeah, stay tuned for that as well to better understand how that all comes together. Yeah, that's
Great.
all from my
Of
side.
course, I'm going to write your details also in the description. So whoever wants to find you can reach out to you through your LinkedIn profile, as you shared. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for joining us. It was a great and insightful podcast. So thank you a lot for your time.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.